The charity gala at the Meridian Hotel was supposed to be our night. Marcus had been planning it for months, positioning himself as the rising star of the pharmaceutical industry, the visionary CEO who would revolutionize cancer treatment. What he didn't know was that I had been planning for much longer. "Sweetheart, could you grab me another drink?" Marcus's voice carried that particular tone, the one he reserved for when he wanted to establish dominance in front of his colleagues. "And maybe try not to monopolize the conversation this time. These are important people." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled graciously, the same practiced smile I'd perfected. Over 7 years of marriage. Around us, 300 of the city's most influential figures mingled in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, champagne glasses catching the light from crystal chandeliers. None of them suspected that the demure wife in the understated black dress was about to orchestrate the most spectacular professional downfall they'd ever witness. "Of course, darling," I replied, letting my fingers brush his arm in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture. In reality, I was activating the recording device hidden in his cufflink, a little insurance policy I'd installed months ago. I made my way toward the bar. I caught fragments of conversations that would have made Marcus's blood run cold if he'd been listening. Dr. Rebecca Chen from the FDA was discussing irregularities in clinical trial data. Senator Williams was questioning the ethics of fast-tracking experimental drugs. Judge Harrison was mentioning new precedents in pharmaceutical liability cases. They weren't random topics. I had carefully orchestrated each conversation through months of strategic seeding. A suggestion here, a document there, a well-placed introduction. Tonight, the seeds were blooming into a garden of consequences Marcus had unwittingly planted himself. "Mrs. Whitmore." The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Kellerman, head of oncology at Preston Medical. We'd met several times before, though Marcus always dismissed our conversations as wife chatter. If only he knew that Dr. Kellerman had been one of my closest collaborators for the past 18 months. "Dr. Kellerman, how lovely to see you." I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "I trust everything is proceeding as planned?" She nodded almost imperceptibly. "The review board meets Monday morning. All the documentation has been submitted." Her eyes flicked toward Marcus, who was holding court near the auction display. "He has no idea, does he?" "None whatsoever." I watched my husband gesture animatedly, probably telling the story about how he'd single-handedly saved the company's latest drug trial. The irony was delicious. He was bragging about research I had actually conducted, using data I had meticulously fabricated to expose his willingness to cut corners for profit. The first phase of tonight's revelation would begin in exactly 27 minutes. Marcus was scheduled to give a keynote speech about ethical innovation in modern medicine. The speech I had helped him write, the one filled with noble sentiments about patient welfare and scientific integrity, the same speech that would be followed by a presentation of evidence that would destroy everything he claimed to stand for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mrs. Whitmore?" A young reporter from Medical Tribune appeared at my elbow. Jessica Park, if I remembered correctly, ambitious, hungry for a breakthrough story, and completely unaware that she was about to get the scoop of her career. "I was hoping to get a few quotes about your husband's work, perhaps some insight into his research methodology." I glanced around, ensuring Marcus was still occupied with his admirers. "I'd be delighted to share some insights, but perhaps after his speech? I have some materials that might interest you. Documentation about his innovative approaches to clinical trials." The materials in question were currently locked in a briefcase in our hotel suite upstairs. Tomorrow, they would be in the hands of the FBI, the FDA, the SEC, and every major pharmaceutical watchdog organization in the country. But tonight, they would serve a more immediate purpose. My phone buzzed discreetly. A text from Dr. Martinez, the investigator I'd been feeding information for the past year. Team in position. Recording equipment active. Financial records uploaded to secure server. Perfect. Phase 1 was nearly complete. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator's voice echoed through the ballroom. If you could please take your seats, we're ready to begin this evening's presentations. I made my way back to the head table, where Marcus was straightening his tie and checking his notes one final time. The notes I had helped him organize, the speech I had encouraged him to give, the moment I had been orchestrating for months. Nervous? I asked, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. Not at all, he replied with that characteristic smirk. These people are about to witness greatness. After tonight, everyone will know that Marcus Whitmore is the future of pharmaceutical innovation. How right he was. After tonight, everyone would indeed know Marcus Whitmore's name. Just not in the way he expected. The lights dimmed as Marcus took the stage, his confident stride carrying him to the podium. He looked magnificent up there, tall, distinguished, every inch the successful executive. The audience settled into respectful attention as he began his carefully rehearsed opening. Friends, colleagues, distinguished guests, his voice carried perfectly through the sound system. Tonight I want to talk to you about the sacred trust between pharmaceutical companies and the patients we serve. About the absolute necessity of ethical research, transparent data, and unwavering commitment to public safety. I listened to each word, remembering how we'd practiced this speech together in our home office. How he'd asked for my input on phrasing, my suggestions for emotional beats, my advice on connecting with the audience. How completely he trusted my guidance, never suspecting that I was choreographing his own destruction. 20 minutes into his speech, Marcus reached the section about transparency in clinical trials. We must never compromise patient safety for profit, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. Every data point must be accurate, every result honestly reported, every decision made with absolute integrity. That was my cue. I rose from my seat and moved quietly toward the back of the room where Jessica Park was taking notes. Dr. Kellerman was already positioned near the exit, along with 3 other key figures I'd strategically placed throughout. The evening. My phone buzzed again. Dr. Martinez. FBI contacts confirmed for tomorrow morning. SEC investigation officially opened as of 8 p.m. tonight. All evidence packages delivered. The irony was exquisite. While Marcus stood on stage proclaiming his ethical standards, federal investigators were already reviewing evidence of his systematic fraud. While he spoke about transparency, they were examining hidden bank accounts and falsified research data. While he preached about integrity, they were building a case that would send him to federal prison. But the evening's entertainment was just beginning. As Marcus concluded his speech to enthusiastic applause, I made my way to the small staging area behind the ballroom. Hidden there was the briefcase I'd prepared for this moment, the one containing documents that would transform this elegant charity gala into a crime scene. Magnificent speech, I whispered to Marcus as he returned to our table, his face flushed with triumph and adrenaline. Thank you, darling. Though I noticed you disappeared during the standing ovation. Just preparing your surprise, I said, letting my fingers trail along his arm. I have something special planned for you. His eyes lit up with anticipation. Marcus loved surprises, especially ones that made him look good in front of important people. He had no idea that tonight's surprise would be the last pleasant moment of his professional life. The evening's program continued with the charity auction, each lot carefully selected to appeal to the pharmaceutical elite. Signed memorabilia from Nobel Prize winners, private dinners with FDA officials, exclusive access to medical conferences. I had helped organize several of the lots, using them as opportunities to gauge attendees' reactions and gather intelligence. But the real auction was happening behind the scenes. Every conversation I'd facilitated, every document I'd strategically leaked, Every introduction I'd arranged, all of it designed to create a perfect storm of scrutiny that would engulf Marcus. The moment the truth emerged. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Dr. Kellerman appeared at my side as the auction concluded. "I believe it's time." I nodded, checking my watch. 10:47 p.m. In exactly 13 minutes, the timeline I'd spent 18 months constructing would culminate in Marcus's complete professional annihilation. "Marcus," I said, standing and smoothing my dress, "could you join me for a moment? There's something I need to show you." He followed me toward the small presentation area, probably assuming this was part of whatever surprise I'd prepared. Other guests were beginning to migrate toward the bar and networking areas, but a core group remained seated, the same group I'd carefully identified as key witnesses for what was about to unfold. I opened my briefcase and removed a manila folder, thick with documentation. Marcus's expression shifted from anticipation to confusion as I spread the papers across the small table. "What is this?" he asked, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "These," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the acoustic space, "are the real clinical trial results from your Oncozyme project, the actual data before you had it modified." The color drained from his face as he recognized the documents. Around us, conversations began to quiet as people sensed something significant happening. "Sarah, what are you doing?" His voice was barely a whisper, but in the hushed atmosphere, it carried to the nearby tables. "I'm sharing some information that I think our guests might find interesting." I lifted the top sheet, holding it so others could see. "For instance, this shows that your miracle cancer drug actually increased tumor growth in 37% of test subjects. Information that somehow disappeared from your FDA submission." Marcus lunged forward, trying to grab the papers, but I was faster. I'd practiced this moment dozens of times, choreographed every movement. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying across the ballroom, "I apologize for interrupting your evening, but I have some urgent information about pharmaceutical safety that you need to hear." The room fell silent. 300 faces turned toward us, including federal agents who had been posing as regular guests, journalists who thought they were covering a routine charity event, and investigators who had been waiting months for this moment. Marcus stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. This was the moment I had been building toward, not just his humiliation, but his complete exposure before the very people whose respect and admiration he craved most. "You see," I continued, holding up another document, "my husband has been systematically falsifying research data, bribing FDA officials, and putting thousands of cancer patients at risk for the sake of profit, and I have 18 months of evidence to prove it." The silence was deafening. Then, like a dam bursting, chaos erupted. Reporters surged forward, cameras appeared, federal agents began moving toward Marcus, and the pharmaceutical elite who had been applauding him minutes earlier started backing away as if he carried a contagious disease. Marcus's face had gone from pale to gray. "Sarah, please," he whispered, reaching toward me. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Actually," I replied, stepping back from his reach, "I understand perfectly. I've been documenting your crimes for 18 months, building an airtight case, and waiting for the perfect moment to destroy you in front of everyone who matters in your industry." His legs seemed to give out as he sank into a nearby chair. Around us, the elegant charity gala was transforming into a media circus and crime scene, exactly as I had planned. As federal agents approached with their badges visible and journalists shouted questions, I felt a profound sense of completion. The man who had humiliated me in public for years, who had dismissed my intelligence, my contributions, my very worth, was finally facing consequences. But this was only the beginning. The real reckoning, the systematic destruction of everything he had built through fraud and arrogance, would unfold over the coming days and weeks. The performance was over. Now came the encore. The federal agents escorted Marcus from the ballroom, in handcuffs, But not before every camera in the room captured the moment. Tomorrow's headlines were already writing themselves. Pharmaceutical CEO arrested at charity gala. Cancer drug fraud exposed by whistleblower wife. Marcus Whitmore, from industry hero to federal criminal. I remained in the ballroom for another hour, calmly answering questions from investigators and providing additional documentation. The briefcase I'd prepared contained only a fraction of the evidence I'd compiled, just enough to create the spectacle Marcus deserved, while keeping the truly devastating materials in reserve for the legal proceedings to come. Mrs. Whitmore, Agent Davidson from the FBI approached as the crowd finally began to disperse. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow for a formal statement. Your cooperation has been invaluable to this investigation." "Of course," I replied, maintaining the composed demeanor I'd practiced for months. "I have additional materials at home that you'll find useful. Financial records, recorded conversations, correspondence with co-conspirators." Agent Davidson's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've been planning this for some time." 18 months, I confirmed. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every moment choreographed for maximum impact. As I finally left the hotel, my phone was already buzzing with messages. Reporters wanting exclusive interviews, colleagues expressing shock, friends asking if I needed support. But the most satisfying message came from Dr. Kellerman. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Stock price already dropping in after-hours trading. Phase 2 was beginning. I drove home to our Beacon Hill townhouse, the same elegant facade that had hosted so many dinner parties where Marcus had belittled my intelligence in front of guests. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose, as the staging ground for the complete dismantling of his life. The house felt different as I walked through the front door. For 7 years, these rooms had been filled with Marcus's presence, his voice, his assumptions about our future together. Now they felt like a museum of a relationship that had been dead for months, kept alive only by my need to maintain the perfect cover for my investigation. I climbed the stairs to Marcus's home office, the sanctuary where he conducted his most sensitive business calls, where he kept his private files, where he planned the schemes that would soon destroy him. The irony was perfect. This room would now become the center of his undoing. I pulled out my laptop and began uploading the remaining evidence files to secure servers. Bank statements showing bribes to FDA officials, audio recordings of conversations, where Marcus discussed falsifying trial data, email chains revealing his conspiracy with other pharmaceutical executives, video footage of meetings where they planned to suppress negative research results. Each file represented weeks or months of careful documentation, hidden cameras in his office, recording devices in his car, keystroke loggers on his computers, financial surveillance of his accounts. I had become an expert in covert investigation, learning skills I never thought I'd need as a biochemist turned corporate wife. My phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "One phone call from jail," I answered, settling into his leather chair. "How thoughtful of you to use it on me." "Sarah, what the hell have you done?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. "You've destroyed everything we built together." "Everything you built through fraud and corruption," I corrected. "I simply documented it. Though I'm curious, did you really think I wouldn't notice when you started stealing my research?" Silence on the other end. Then, "What are you talking about?" "The oncozyme compound, Marcus. The base formula that you claim to have developed? I created that in my lab 3 years ago. You stole my work, corrupted it for profit, and then took credit for it while treating me like an incompetent housewife." More. Silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "How long have you known?" "I've known about your fraud for 2 years. I've been documenting it for 18 months, and I've been planning tonight for 6 months. I leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. "Did you really think you could humiliate me in public, dismiss my intelligence, steal my work, and there would be no consequences?" "Sarah, please. We can work this out. I can make amends." The lawyers can... The lawyers can't help you, Marcus. I made sure of that. I pulled up another file on my laptop. Shall I tell you about the asset seizure warrants? Or the criminal conspiracy charges? Or perhaps you'd like to know about the civil lawsuits that will be filed tomorrow by every patient harmed by your fraudulent drugs. The line went quiet except for the sound of his ragged breathing. You humiliated me in public for the last time, Marcus. But my revenge? It's just getting started. I hung up and returned to my work. The files I was uploading would be automatically distributed to prosecutors, regulatory agencies, and media outlets at precisely 6 a.m. By the time Marcus was released on bail, if he was released on bail, his entire world would be in ruins. But first, I had some personal business to attend, too. I walked to our bedroom and began packing a suitcase. Not with the designer clothes Marcus had bought me to play the part of the successful executive's wife, but with my own things, the practical clothes I preferred, the books that reflected my actual interests, the personal items that represented who I really was beneath the facade I'd maintained for so long. The DNA results were in the top drawer of my dresser, sealed in an envelope I'd never shown Marcus. The fertility specialist had been clear. Marcus was sterile, had been since childhood. The elaborate attempts at starting a family, the expensive treatments, the emotional roller coaster, all of it unnecessary theater because Marcus had known the truth and hidden it from me. Another betrayal, another lie, another manipulation. But also another piece of evidence for the divorce proceedings that would follow his criminal trial. My laptop chimed with an incoming message from Dr. Martinez. Media packages delivered to all major networks. Financial investigation expanded to include Swiss accounts. Congressional hearings scheduled for next week. The Swiss accounts were particularly damaging. Marcus had been funneling bribe money through a complex network of shell companies, thinking his financial crimes were untraceable. What he didn't know was that I had been documenting every transaction, building a complete picture of his corruption that spanned multiple countries and currencies. I moved to the guest bedroom where I'd been secretly living for the past 3 months, maintaining the pretense of our marriage while gathering the final pieces of evidence. The bed was made, but the dresser contained my real wardrobe, my research notes, my plans for the life I would build after Marcus's destruction was complete. A soft knock at the front door interrupted my packing. Through the security monitor, I could see Dr. Rebecca Chen from the FDA still in her evening gown from the gala. "Rebecca," I said, opening the door. "I wasn't expecting you. I couldn't sleep," she admitted, stepping inside. "What you did tonight, it was remarkable, but also terrifying. Do you realize how many people are going to be affected by this?" I led her to the living room, pouring 2 glasses of wine from a bottle Marcus had been saving for a special occasion. How fitting that it would be consumed in celebration of his downfall. 4 pharmaceutical companies are implicated in the evidence I've compiled, I said, handing her a glass. 17 executives, 32 FDA officials, 8 congressional representatives. The corruption Marcus was part of reaches into every level of the system. Rebecca sank into the couch. The ramifications will be enormous. Stock markets, drug approvals, patient trust, everything will be affected. Good, I replied simply. The system is broken. Patients are dying because executives like Marcus prioritize profits over safety. If my revenge against one arrogant man helps fix that system, then the collateral damage is worth it. She studied my face carefully. This wasn't just about personal revenge, was it? You could have divorced him quietly, taken half his assets, moved on with your life. Why the public exposure? I sat across from her, considering the question. Because quiet divorce would have left him free to continue harming people. Because his humiliation of me was just a symptom of a deeper arrogance that made him believe he was above consequences. Because sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to drag them into the light where everyone can see what they really are. Rebecca nodded slowly. The congressional hearing will be brutal. They'll want you to testify. I'm counting on it. I pulled out a tablet, showing her the presentation I'd been preparing. I have enough evidence to bring down the entire network Marcus was part of. Tomorrow's arrest is just the opening move. We spent the next hour reviewing the evidence together, Rebecca providing context about regulatory processes while I explained the intricate web of corruption I'd uncovered. By the time she left, we had outlined a strategy that would transform my personal revenge into a systemic reform movement. The house felt different after she was gone. Not empty, but liberated. For years, these rooms had contained the pressure of maintaining a lie, the exhaustion of pretending to be someone I wasn't, the constant vigilance required to document Marcus's crimes without exposing my true purpose. Now, with the truth, finally, revealed, I could breathe freely for the first time in months. I returned to Marcus's office and opened his personal safe. The combination was my birthday, a detail that might have seemed romantic if I hadn't known it was simply the most convenient date he could remember. Inside were documents that would provide the final pieces of my evidence collection: offshore, account statements, insurance policies with fraudulent beneficiaries, contracts with bribes built into consulting fees. Each document represented another nail in the coffin of his defense. His lawyers would try to claim ignorance, paint him as a victim of subordinates or industry pressure. But the evidence I'd compiled showed clear, deliberate, systematic fraud orchestrated personally by Marcus over several years. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is just the beginning. You have no idea what you've started." I smiled, recognizing the writing style as belonging to Dr. Harrison Pike, one of Marcus's co-conspirators, and the next target on my list. Tomorrow's arrests would include him, but tonight he was probably panicking, trying to cover his tracks, calling his lawyers and wondering how much I really knew. The answer was everything. I had spent 18 months becoming an expert in their operations, learning their methods, understanding their weaknesses, Pike's gambling addiction that made him vulnerable to financial pressure, Dr. Susan Crawford's affair with a married senator that could destroy her career, CEO David Morgan's hidden medical condition that would invalidate his insurance policies. Each of them had vulnerabilities, and each of them had participated in Marcus's schemes. My revenge against Marcus would expand to encompass all of them, a domino effect that would cleanse the entire corrupt network. Another message arrived, this one from Jessica Park. "Exclusive interview tomorrow? This story is going to change everything." I typed back, "Not just an interview. I'll give you enough material for a book. Meet me at 10 a.m. The interview would be carefully orchestrated, just like everything else. Jessica would get her career-making scoop, but she would also become a vehicle for delivering carefully planned information that would maximize the damage to Marcus and his associates." As dawn approached, I completed the final uploads and security protocols. Every piece of evidence was now safely stored in multiple locations, backed up across different servers, and scheduled for automatic distribution if anything happened to me. Marcus's associates might be desperate enough to try intimidation or worse, but I had planned for those contingencies too. I walked through the house one last time, collecting the few remaining items that belonged to my real self rather than the facade I'd maintained. The wedding photos would stay, not out of sentimentality, but as evidence of the timeline of our relationship and Marcus's gradual transformation from ambitious scientist to corrupt executive. By 6 a.m., my suitcase was packed and loaded in my car. The evidence distribution had begun automatically, flooding prosecutors and media outlets with documentation of pharmaceutical corruption. My phone was already ringing with calls from reporters, investigators, and lawyers. But first I had one more stop to make. Dr. Kellerman had texted an address, a safe house where I could stay while the media storm intensified and legal proceedings began. It would give me a secure base of operations for the next phase of my plan. As I drove away from the house where I'd spent 7 years of my life, I felt no nostalgia or regret. That chapter was over. Marcus had tried to humiliate me in public, to reduce me to a decorative accessory in his life of fraud and corruption. Instead, he had awakened something far more dangerous. A brilliant woman with nothing left to lose and the skills to destroy everything he held dear. The morning news was already beginning to report the story. Pharmaceutical executive arrested in massive fraud scheme. FDA officials implicated in drug safety cover-up. Industry wife exposes. Husband's criminal enterprise. Phase 2 was officially underway, and Marcus was about to discover that his public humiliation at the gala had been merely the appetizer before the main course of his destruction. The safe house was a modest apartment in Cambridge, deliberately unremarkable and strategically located near MIT, where I could access research facilities if needed. Dr. Kellerman had arranged it through her network of contacts, people who understood the importance of protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. By 7 a.m., my phone had received 43 calls from reporters, 16 from law enforcement agencies, and one particularly venomous voicemail from Marcus's mother, threatening to destroy my reputation. I smiled at that last one. Destroying reputations was exactly what I specialized in now. Jessica Park arrived precisely at 10 a.m., accompanied by a camera crew and looking like someone who'd hit the journalism lottery, which, in a sense, she had. Mrs. Whitmore, or should I say Dr. Whitmore, she began, settling into the chair across from my temporary desk. Dr. Whitmore is correct, I replied, enjoying the surprise that flickered across her face. I have a PhD in biochemistry from Harvard. Marcus preferred that people not know about my education. He found it threatening. Jessica's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. Let's start with how you discovered your husband's crimes. For the next 3 hours, I methodically laid out the story. Not the complete truth, that would be revealed gradually, strategically, for maximum impact, but enough to paint a picture of systematic deception and corruption that extended far beyond Marcus himself. The oncozyme fraud was particularly personal, I explained, pulling out copies of my original research notes. These are my laboratory records from 2021, showing the development of the base compound that Marcus later claimed as his own invention. He literally stole my life's work and perverted it for profit. Jessica's eyes widened as she examined the documents. You created the original formula? Not just the formula. The entire research methodology, the testing protocols, the safety assessments. Marcus took my work, stripped out the safety features that would have prevented harmful side effects, and rushed it to market. I leaned forward, letting my anger show for the first time. 17 patients died in the clinical trials because he removed the safeguards I built into the compound. That revelation would make headlines. The story of a brilliant scientist whose work was stolen and corrupted by her own husband would generate the kind of public outrage that made congressional investigations inevitable. How long have you been planning this exposure? Jessica asked. The exposure began the day I realized Marcus had no intention of correcting the safety issues with oncozyme. But the planning... I paused, choosing my words carefully. The planning began the night he publicly humiliated me at the Patterson Medical Gala last year. I had never told this story before, had buried it beneath months of careful preparation and cold calculation. But now, with Jessica's camera rolling, it felt like the right moment to reveal the catalyst for everything that followed. We were seated at a table with FDA officials, congressional representatives, other pharmaceutical executives, important people whose respect Marcus craved. During dinner, the conversation turned to drug safety protocols, and I offered some suggestions based on my research background. I looked directly into the camera. Marcus laughed. He actually laughed and said, "Sarah's adorable when she tries to understand complex scientific concepts. But let's leave the real thinking to the professionals. Jessica's expression shifted, from professional interest to personal indignation. He said that in front of FDA officials? In front of everyone. Then he patted my hand like I was a child and changed the subject. The memory still stung, but now it served a purpose. That was the moment I realized my husband didn't just dismiss my intelligence. He was actively undermining it to make himself look better. And if he could do that to me, what was he doing to patients who trusted him? The interview continued. For another hour, covering the technical details of Marcus's fraud, the evidence I'd compiled, and the broader implications for pharmaceutical safety. Jessica was thorough, asking probing questions that allowed me to reveal information strategically while maintaining the appearance of spontaneous disclosure. After she left, I turned my attention to the legal proceedings that were rapidly accelerating. Marcus's bail hearing was scheduled for tomorrow, and his lawyers were already trying to discredit my evidence by attacking my motivations. My phone rang. Agent Davidson from the FBI. Dr. Whitmore, we need to discuss security arrangements. Your husband's associates are making threats, and we have reason to believe they might attempt to intimidate you before you testify. What kind of threats? I asked, though I had been expecting this development. Phone calls to your family members, suspicious vehicles near your home, attempts to access your financial records. Standard intimidation tactics. But we're taking them seriously. I pulled up the surveillance feeds I'd been monitoring since leaving the house. Agent Davidson, I've been documenting their retaliation attempts since 3 a.m. Would you like me to send you the evidence? Silence on the other end. Then, you've been conducting your own surveillance? For 18 months, I've been conducting surveillance on everyone connected to Marcus's operation. Their attempts to intimidate me are just providing additional evidence of criminal conspiracy. An hour later, Agent Davidson arrived at the safe house with a security team, clearly unsure whether I was a victim in need of protection or a vigilante operating outside legal boundaries. I showed him my evidence collection system, hidden cameras, audio recording equipment, financial monitoring software, and digital tracking tools. Dr. Whitmore, he said slowly, this level of surveillance requires considerable expertise. How did you acquire these skills? YouTube, I replied with a straight face. Amazing what you can learn when your husband thinks you're too stupid to understand technology. That wasn't entirely true. I'd also taken private investigator courses online, studied forensic accounting, and spent countless hours learning covert surveillance techniques. But the basic principle was accurate. Marcus's dismissal of my intelligence had given me the freedom to develop skills he never suspected I possessed. Agent Davidson's phone buzzed. He answered, listened for a moment, then looked at me with new respect. That was the prosecutor's office. The evidence you provided has already resulted in 3 additional arrests. Dr. Pike, Dr. Crawford, and CEO Morgan were taken into custody this morning. Perfect. Phase 3 was proceeding exactly as planned. Their lawyers are claiming they were misled by your husband, Agent Davidson continued, that Marcus was the mastermind and they were unwitting participants. I pulled up files on my laptop, showing detailed evidence of each executive's voluntary participation in the fraud. Dr. Pike initiated contact with FDA officials to suppress negative trial results. Dr. Crawford personally altered laboratory data to hide safety issues. CEO Morgan authorized payments to congressional representatives to fast-track drug approvals. They weren't unwitting, they were eager participants. The evidence was overwhelming, meticulously documented, and legally bulletproof. I had spent months ensuring that every piece of information would hold up in court, that every allegation could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. My phone chimed with a news alert. Pharmaceutical stocks plummet as fraud investigation expands. The financial impact was already significant, but it would get much worse. The evidence I'd provided would trigger investigations at dozens of companies, market withdrawals of compromised drugs, and regulatory reforms that would cost the industry billions. Marcus had humiliated me to look important in front of these powerful people. Now those same people were watching their careers and fortunes collapse because of my revenge. Dr. Kellerman called with an update from the medical community. Emergency meetings at every major pharmaceutical company. They're all scrambling to review their own practices, terrified of being caught in the expanding investigation. As they should be, I replied. The corruption Marcus was part of infected the entire industry. My evidence will expose all of it. That evening, I watched the news coverage from my temporary refuge. Every major network was running the story, and the narrative was exactly what I had crafted. Brilliant scientist discovers husband's fraud, risks everything to expose corruption that endangered patients. The interview with Jessica Park aired at 8 p.m., and my phone immediately exploded with interview requests. But I was selective about media appearances, choosing outlets that would maximize the impact of my revelations while maintaining control over the narrative. Marcus's lawyers held a press conference, painting him as a dedicated scientist whose work was being mischaracterized by a vindictive wife. They displayed his awards, his charitable contributions, his reputation in the medical community, everything that made his fall from grace more dramatic. I countered with my own evidence release, audio recordings of Marcus discussing how to hide, negative trial results, emails where he bragged about bribing officials, and financial records showing his personal profit from the fraudulent schemes. The lawyers went quiet after that. By 11 p.m., the stock market in Asia was already reacting to the scandal. Pharmaceutical companies worldwide were losing value as investors anticipated broader investigations and regulatory crackdowns. The ripple effects of my carefully orchestrated revenge were spreading globally. I received a call from Congressman Bradley, chair of the House Subcommittee on Health. Dr. Whitmore, we're convening emergency hearings on pharmaceutical fraud. Your testimony will be crucial to our investigation. I'll be honored to testify, I replied. I have evidence that will demonstrate systematic corruption across multiple companies and regulatory agencies. How extensive is this corruption? I looked at my evidence files, thousands of documents representing months of investigation. Congressman, what I've revealed so far is less than 20% of what I've documented. The full scope of the corruption will shock you. After he hung up, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The Congressional hearing would be the perfect platform for the next phase of my revenge, the systematic exposure of every crime, every cover-up, every betrayal that Marcus and his associates had committed. Marcus had tried to humiliate me by dismissing my intelligence in front of powerful people. Soon, those same people would be sitting in congressional hearing rooms, watching me methodically destroy the careers and reputations of everyone who had participated in his corrupt schemes. The media storm was intensifying, but it was still just the beginning. The real destruction would come when I testified under oath, backed by 18 months of irrefutable evidence, in front of cameras broadcasting to the entire world. Marcus wanted to show everyone how important he was. Soon, everyone would indeed know his name, as the centerpiece of the largest pharmaceutical fraud scandal in history. I settled in for the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring Marcus's bail hearing, more arrests, and the continuation of a revenge plan that had already exceeded my most optimistic projections. The man who had dismissed me as an adorable but incompetent wife was about to discover that I was the most dangerous opponent he could have possibly imagined. Phase 4 would begin at dawn, and with it, the complete annihilation of everything Marcus had built through lies, theft, and arrogance. Marcus's bail hearing drew a media circus that transformed the federal courthouse into a battlefield of competing narratives. I arrived early, dressed in a conservative navy suit that projected competence and credibility, a stark contrast to the decorative wife role Marcus had forced me to play for years. His defense team had clearly prepared for psychological warfare. Attorney Richard Sterling, one of Boston's most expensive criminal lawyers, had positioned Marcus to look as sympathetic as possible. Rumpled clothing, exhausted expression, the image of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, and it might have worked if I hadn't spent 18 months documenting his calculated cruelty. Your Honor, Sterling began his argument, my client is a respected scientist and community leader being destroyed by a vengeful wife who has systematically violated his privacy and trust. Dr. Marcus Whitmore poses no flight risk and requests release on his own recognizance. Judge Patricia Henley, whom I'd researched extensively, was known for her no-nonsense approach to white-collar crime. She had presided over several pharmaceutical fraud cases and understood the industry's capacity for corruption. Prosecutor Amanda Walsh stood to respond. Your Honor, the defendant has access to significant overseas assets, has already attempted to transfer funds to offshore accounts, and represents a clear flight risk. Additionally, the evidence suggests ongoing criminal activity that could continue if he's released. That was my cue. I had provided Walsh with real-time evidence of Marcus's attempts to obstruct justice from his jail cell, recorded conversations with associates, coded messages to his lawyers about destroying evidence, and instructions to transfer remaining funds to untraceable accounts. Furthermore, Walsh continued, the government has evidence that the defendant has been attempting to intimidate the primary witness against him, including threats made through intermediaries to his estranged wife. Sterling shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. These allegations are unsubstantiated and are documented with audio recordings, financial transactions, and corroborating witness testimony, Walsh interrupted smoothly. All provided by Dr. Sarah Whitmore, whose cooperation has been essential to uncovering the full scope of this conspiracy. Judge Henley's expression hardened as Walsh played selected audio clips. Marcus's voice filled the courtroom, discussing ways to discredit my testimony, plans to access hidden assets, and instructions to associates about maintaining their stories despite mounting evidence. The most damaging recording was from yesterday evening. Sarah thinks she's so smart, but she has no idea how deep this goes. If she testifies, we'll destroy her professionally and personally. No one will hire her, publish her research, or take her seriously ever again. Marcus visibly flinched as his words echoed through the courtroom. The recording captured not just obstruction of justice, but the arrogance and vindictiveness that had characterized our entire marriage. Judge Henley reviewed the documents Walsh had submitted, her frown deepening with each page. Mr. Sterling, your client appears to have used his phone privileges to continue criminal activity while in custody. This demonstrates both ongoing danger to witnesses and complete disregard for the legal process. Your Honor, if I may... Sterling began desperately. You may not, Judge Henley cut him off. Bail denied. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial, with limited phone privileges subject to monitoring. Marcus's face went white as the bailiffs approached. He turned toward me, his expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally, grudging recognition of how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. I met his gaze calmly, letting him see the satisfaction in my eyes. This was what happened when you underestimated your opponent. Outside the courthouse, the media scrum was intense. Reporters shouted questions, cameras captured every angle, and I gave carefully prepared statements that advanced my narrative while revealing nothing that might compromise the investigation. Dr. Whitmore, how do you respond to claims that you violated your husband's privacy? One reporter called out. I documented crimes that endangered patients, I replied evenly. When someone is systematically defrauding cancer patients and bribing government officials, privacy concerns become secondary to public safety. What's your response to threats against your safety? The same people who tried to silence patients and suppress safety data are now trying to intimidate me. It proves how desperate they've become. I paused for effect. But I won't be silenced. Too many lives are at stake. Agent Davidson escorted me through the crowd to a waiting vehicle. The security arrangements had been upgraded after yesterday's threats escalated into more direct action. 2 attempts to hack my computer systems, surveillance teams following my movements, and a suspicious package delivered to my old address. Congressional hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday, he informed me as we drove away from the courthouse. That gives us 5 days to prepare your testimony and ensure your security. I've been preparing for months, I replied, checking messages on my secure phone. The challenge will be deciding how much evidence to reveal in public versus saving for criminal trials. My strategy was deliberate. Use the congressional hearing to create maximum public impact while preserving the most damaging evidence for court proceedings where it would carry legal weight. The hearing would be theater, but theater with consequences. Doctor. Kellerman had arranged a secure conference room at a medical research facility where I could finalize my testimony without surveillance concerns. When I arrived, I found an unexpected audience. 3 of the most respected medical researchers in the country, along with 2 former FDA officials who had witnessed the corruption firsthand. Dr. Whitmore introduced Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, former FDA chief scientist. We're here to help you understand the full impact of what you're revealing. For the next 4 hours, they walked me through the regulatory system's vulnerabilities, explaining how Marcus and his associates had exploited every weakness to maximize profit while minimizing oversight. Their insights helped me refine my testimony to target the specific systemic failures that enabled the corruption. The Oncozyme case isn't isolated, explained Dr. Michael Torres, who had conducted independent research on drug safety protocols. We've identified at least 12 other compounds that show similar patterns of manipulated data and suppressed safety information. That revelation opened new avenues for investigation. I provided them with my evidence files related to those other drugs, watching their expressions shift from concern to horror as they realized the scope of the deception. This is systematic fraud across multiple therapeutic categories, Dr. Hayes said quietly. The number of affected patients could be in the tens of thousands. Which is why the congressional hearing is so crucial, I replied. Public outrage will force regulatory reforms that the industry has been fighting for years. Dr. Torres looked up from the documents he'd been reviewing. Dr. Whitmore, your research methodology here is exceptional. You've essentially conducted a comprehensive audit of pharmaceutical corruption, using investigative techniques that surpass anything we've seen from official sources. The compliment was particularly satisfying coming from someone of his stature. For years, Marcus had dismissed my scientific abilities while stealing my work. Now leading researchers were acknowledging the quality of investigation he could never have conducted himself. That evening, I returned to the safe house to find my sister Emily waiting with takeout dinner and moral support. She was one of the few people who knew the complete truth about my marriage and had been quietly helping with logistical support throughout my investigation. You look exhausted, she observed, setting out containers of Thai food. When was the last time you slept? More than 4 hours? Sleep is for people who aren't dismantling criminal enterprises, I replied, but I accepted the food gratefully. How are Mom and Dad handling the media attention? Better than expected. Dad keeps telling everyone that he always knew you were brilliant, and Mom is fielding interview requests from women's magazines about raising strong daughters. Emily smiled. They're proud of you, even if they're worried about your safety. The family support meant more than I had expected. For months I had been isolated, maintaining the facade of a dutiful wife while secretly documenting crimes. Having people who understood and supported my choices provided emotional strength for the challenges ahead. My secure phone buzzed with a message from Prosecutor Walsh. Additional arrests tomorrow morning. Your evidence regarding the Swiss accounts has yielded 4 more conspirators, including 2 sitting congressmen. The congressional arrests would escalate the scandal to a new level. When lawmakers became defendants, the political establishment would be forced to take action that went far beyond normal regulatory responses. Emily, I said, looking up from my phone, you should probably avoid being associated with me publicly for the next few weeks. This is about to get much bigger. She raised an eyebrow. How much bigger? I showed her the message about the congressional arrests. watching her expression shift from concern to amazement. "Sarah, what exactly have you uncovered?" "A conspiracy that reaches into Congress, federal agencies, and pharmaceutical companies across multiple countries. Marcus was just one node in a network of corruption that's been operating for years." I leaned back in my chair. "And I have evidence of all of it." Emily was quiet for a long moment. "Do you realize that you're essentially taking on the entire medical industrial complex?" "Yes," I replied simply. "And I'm going to win." That confidence wasn't bravado. It was the result of 18 months of meticulous planning and evidence gathering. Every piece of information had been verified, every allegation backed by documentation, every strategic move calculated for maximum impact. Marcus had humiliated me because he thought I was powerless. He was about to discover that I had quietly assembled enough evidence to bring down not just him, but the entire corrupt system he was part of. The Congressional hearing would be my debut on the national stage, the moment when the quiet biochemist he had dismissed would emerge as the most dangerous witness in Washington. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and I was ready to deliver testimony that would reshape the pharmaceutical industry and destroy everyone who had participated in Marcus's schemes. Wednesday couldn't come soon enough. The man who had called my scientific insights adorable would watch me present evidence to Congress that would result in criminal prosecutions, regulatory overhauls, and the collapse of careers he had spent years building. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson would be unforgettable. The Hart Senate office building buzzed with an energy I'd never experienced before. The electric tension of a Washington scandal about to unfold on national television. Committee staffers rushed through hallways carrying thick briefing books, reporters positioned themselves for optimal camera angles, and security personnel maintained tight control over access to the hearing room. I sat in the witness preparation room, reviewing my testimony one final time while Agent Davidson coordinated security protocols outside. The past week had brought a cascade of developments that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. 6 more executives arrested, 2 pharmaceutical companies' stocks suspended from trading, and a special prosecutor appointed to investigate Congressional corruption. "Dr. Whitmore," Congressman Bradley entered the room, followed by the committee's chief counsel. "I wanted to personally thank you for your courage in bringing this forward. Your evidence has already triggered the largest healthcare fraud investigation in federal history." "Congressman, this is just the beginning," I replied, gesturing to the stack of documents on the table. "What I'm presenting today represents roughly 30% of the evidence I've compiled. The full scope of the corruption will require months to investigate properly." His expression grew grave as he flipped through my prepared exhibits. Charts showing bribery networks, financial flows between pharmaceutical companies and government officials, timelines of safety data suppression, and patient mortality statistics that had been deliberately hidden from regulators. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, stopping at a chart showing Oncozyme's actual trial results versus the falsified data submitted to the FDA. 17 deaths that could have been prevented if they'd reported the real numbers. 17 confirmed deaths, I corrected. My analysis suggests the actual number is closer to 43 when you include off-label prescriptions and international markets where the drug was approved based on the same fraudulent data. The committee's chief counsel, Maria Santos, looked up from the documents with a prosecutor's intensity. "Dr. Whitmore, your husband's legal team is planning to attack your credibility by focusing on the surveillance methods you used to gather this evidence. How do you respond to claims that you violated attorney-client privilege and conducted illegal wiretapping?" I had anticipated this line of attack. Everything I documented occurred either in public settings, through legally obtained financial records, or via surveillance equipment installed in our shared marital home where I had legal authority to record. Additionally, attorney-client privilege doesn't protect communications about ongoing crimes or plans to commit future crimes. What about the recordings of conversations between your husband and his co-conspirators? Made in my own home, during dinner parties and business meetings that I hosted as his wife. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state for recording, and I was present for every conversation. I pulled out a thick legal brief. My attorneys have prepared comprehensive documentation showing that every piece of evidence was obtained legally. Santos reviewed the brief quickly, her expression shifting from concern to admiration. This is incredibly thorough. You've essentially conducted a professional investigation while maintaining perfect legal compliance. I spent 18 months learning surveillance law, financial fraud detection, and evidence preservation techniques. I knew that if I was going to destroy my husband's career, the evidence had to be bulletproof. Congressman Bradley checked his watch. We're starting in 20 minutes. Is there anything else we should know before you take the stand? I hesitated, then decided it was time to reveal the next level of my strategy. Congressman, during my testimony today, I'm going to name 14 current members of Congress who accepted pharmaceutical bribes through various intermediaries. I have documentation, recordings, and financial evidence for all of them. The silence in the room was deafening. 14? Santos whispered. 7 senators, 7 representatives, both parties, including 2 committee chairs and 1 presidential cabinet nominee whose confirmation is pending. I met their shocked gazes calmly. The corruption goes to the very top of the system. Bradley sank into a chair. Dr. Whitmore, do you understand what you're about to unleash? A constitutional crisis that will force fundamental reforms in how pharmaceutical companies interact with government officials, I replied, which is exactly what needs to happen. 20 minutes later, I walked into the packed hearing room. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle. Major networks had interrupted regular programming for live coverage, and the gallery was filled with reporters, advocates, and family members of patients who had been harmed by fraudulent drugs. At the witness table, I arranged my materials with deliberate precision. 3 binders of evidence, a laptop containing multimedia presentations, and a small recording device for backup documentation. The committee members studied me with expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. They knew they were about to hear testimony that would reshape American healthcare. Chairman Bradley called the hearing to order. Today we examine allegations of systemic fraud in pharmaceutical research and development, regulatory capture of federal agencies, and corruption of the drug approval process. Our witness is Dr. Sarah Whitmore, whose investigation has already resulted in multiple federal indictments. The ranking minority member, Senator Harrison, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Dr. Whitmore, before we begin, I want to address the elephant in the room. You obtained this evidence through what appears to be an elaborate scheme to spy on your own husband. How can Congress trust information gathered through such duplicitous methods? I had prepared for this attack extensively. Senator Harrison, I want to show you something. I activated my laptop, projecting an image onto the room's main screen. It showed a patient identification chart, dozens of names, ages, and medical histories of people who had died or suffered severe complications from oncozyme. Sarah Chen, age 34, mother of 2. Died from complications that would have been prevented if accurate safety data had been reported. I clicked to the next slide. Michael Rodriguez, age 47, high school teacher. Suffered permanent organ damage because warnings about drug interactions were suppressed. I continued through 12 more cases, watching the room grow increasingly somber as each tragic story unfolded. Senator, you're questioning my methods while ignoring the results. These people died because my husband and his associates prioritized profits over patient safety. If spying on my husband was necessary to save future lives, then I would do it again without hesitation. Senator Harrison's combative posture softened noticeably. The emotional impact of real patient stories was exactly what I had calculated. Would neutralize attacks on my character. Dr. Whitmore, Chairman Bradley continued, please tell the committee how you first discovered your husband's fraudulent activities. For the next hour, I methodically laid out the timeline of my investigation, starting with my discovery that Marcus had stolen my original research, progressing through the evidence of systematic data manipulation, and culminating in the exposure of a vast network of corruption that extended throughout the pharmaceutical industry. The Oncozyme case represents a pattern of behavior that spans multiple companies, regulatory agencies, and legislative offices, I testified. My evidence shows that pharmaceutical fraud has become institutionalized, with systematic bribery, ensuring that dangerous drugs reach market while safety concerns are suppressed. Committee members asked increasingly specific questions, allowing me to reveal evidence strategically. Financial records showing cash payments to FDA officials, audio recordings of pharmaceutical executives planning to suppress negative research, email chains discussing which congressional representatives could be bought most cheaply. Dr. Whitmore, Congresswoman Martinez interrupted, you mentioned evidence of congressional involvement in this conspiracy. Could you elaborate? This was the moment I had been building toward. I activated a new presentation showing a complex network diagram of payments, meetings, and policy decisions. Over the past 3 years, 14 current members of Congress received payments totaling over $40 million through shell companies controlled by pharmaceutical interests. In exchange, they influenced regulatory appointments, blocked safety legislation, and fast-tracked drug approvals. The room erupted. Committee members spoke over each other, reporters frantically typed notes, and the gallery buzzed with shocked conversations. Chairman Bradley repeatedly called for order as cameras captured the chaos. Dr. Whitmore, Senator Harrison demanded, his earlier skepticism replaced by urgency. Are you naming sitting members of Congress as participants in criminal conspiracy? I am providing evidence of criminal conspiracy involving sitting members of Congress, I corrected. The naming will be done by federal prosecutors based on this evidence. I began revealing specific cases, each more damaging than the last. Senator Williams had received $2.3 million in consulting fees for his wife's phantom company in exchange for blocking drug safety legislation. Representative Johnson had been given private stock offerings worth $800,000 before pharmaceutical mergers that his committee approved. Senate Majority Whip Davidson had received vacation home renovations worth $150,000 in exchange for fast-tracking FDA appointments. Senator Williams is seated in this chamber today, I noted, looking directly at the man in question. His wife's company, Meridian Consulting, has no office, no employees, and no services other than receiving pharmaceutical money in exchange for legislative favors. Senator Williams was visibly sweating, frantically whispering to his chief of staff. Around the room, other congressional members were checking their phones and consulting with aides, probably wondering if their own names would appear in my evidence. How extensive is this corruption? Chairman Bradley asked, though he looked like he dreaded the answer. Pharmaceutical companies have essentially purchased regulatory capture at every level of government, I replied. FDA officials who approve dangerous drugs receive lucrative private sector jobs. Congressional representatives who support industry positions receive campaign contributions and personal benefits. Cabinet officials who implement favorable policies are guaranteed board positions after leaving office. I had spent months documenting these relationships, creating a comprehensive map of institutional corruption that would make headlines for weeks. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Dr. Whitmore, Congresswoman Lee asked, what role did your husband play in this broader conspiracy? Marcus was a mid-level participant who got careless, I replied. The real architects of this system are pharmaceutical executives who have been operating these schemes for decades, government officials who have institutionalized regulatory capture, and political leaders who have turned healthcare policy into a profit center. I activated my final presentation, showing the organizational chart of what I called the pharmaceutical corruption complex. Names, faces, financial relationships, and policy decisions that demonstrated how completely the system had been compromised. This is the shadow government that actually controls American healthcare policy, I concluded. The evidence I'm providing today will allow prosecutors to dismantle this network and restore legitimate oversight to pharmaceutical development. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, but the damage was done. My testimony had provided a roadmap for investigations that would continue for years, prosecutions that would reshape the industry, and reforms that would fundamentally alter how drugs were developed and approved. As I finally left the witness table, I felt a profound sense of completion. Marcus had humiliated me to look important in front of powerful people. Now, those same people were watching his career and reputation burn while acknowledging my intelligence and expertise on national television. The revenge was perfect, comprehensive, devastating, and ultimately beneficial to society. Marcus wanted to show everyone how insignificant I was. Instead, I had shown everyone how corrupt he was, while positioning myself as the expert who exposed institutional fraud at the highest levels of government. Outside the hearing room, reporters clamored for additional comments. But I had said everything that needed to be said. The evidence spoke for itself, and the consequences would unfold exactly as I had planned. Phase 5 was complete. The final phase would involve watching Marcus and his associates face justice while I rebuilt my life as the woman who had taken on the medical-industrial complex and won. The aftermath of my congressional testimony unfolded like a carefully orchestrated domino effect, each revelation triggering consequences that rippled through every level of the pharmaceutical and political establishment. Within hours of my appearance, the Department of Justice announced a joint task force with the FBI, SEC, and FDA to investigate what media outlets were already calling Pharmgate. I watched the developments from a new safe house in Virginia. This one, arranged by federal marshals as threats against my life, escalated beyond standard witness intimidation. The pharmaceutical lobby had apparently decided that eliminating me was preferable to facing the complete exposure of their operations. Dr. Whitmore, Agent Davidson entered the secure communications room where I was monitoring news coverage. "We've intercepted communications suggesting a coordinated campaign to discredit your testimony. They're bringing in crisis management firms, opposition researchers, and media consultants." I smiled, pulling up files on my encrypted laptop. Let them come. I've been preparing for their counterattack since before I exposed Marcus. The counteroffensive began within 24 hours. A coordinated media blitz questioned my mental stability, suggested I had fabricated evidence out of marital jealousy, and portrayed me as an unhinged woman seeking revenge against an innocent husband. The talking points were sophisticated, professionally crafted, and completely ineffective against the documentation I had prepared. Marcus's mother appeared on morning television, tearfully defending her son while painting me as a manipulative sociopath who had destroyed a brilliant scientist's career. "Sarah was always jealous of Marcus's success," she sobbed into the cameras. "She couldn't handle being married to someone more accomplished than herself." I responded by releasing Marcus's graduate school records, which showed that I had actually helped him complete his dissertation after he struggled with the biochemical analysis. Academic colleagues confirmed that his early research had been largely dependent on my uncredited contributions, painting a picture of systematic intellectual theft that had characterized our entire relationship. The pharmaceutical companies launched their own defensive campaign, hiring the most expensive PR firms in Washington to minimize the damage from my revelations. They positioned the corruption as isolated incidents by rogue employees rather than systematic institutional fraud, hoping to contain the investigation's scope. That strategy collapsed when I released Phase 2 of my evidence, documented proof that every major pharmaceutical company had engaged in similar fraudulent practices, often coordinating their efforts through industry trade associations and shared consulting firms. Dr. Whitmore, Dr. Kellerman called from her office at the medical center. "The peer review committee has completed their analysis of your research methodology. They're recommending you for the Whistleblower Protection Award and offering you a position as chief of pharmaceutical ethics. The professional recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it provided institutional credibility that neutralized attacks on my expertise. The woman Marcus had dismissed as scientifically incompetent was now being recruited by prestigious medical institutions to lead their ethics programs. My secure phone buzzed with an update from Prosecutor Walsh. 14 additional arrests this morning, including 3 pharmaceutical CEOs and 2 FDA division chiefs. Your Swiss banking evidence has opened up an entirely new avenue of investigation. The Swiss accounts had been Marcus's greatest mistake. In his arrogance, he had assumed that foreign banking secrecy would protect his corruption proceeds. What he hadn't realized was that I had been documenting international transfers for over a year, building a comprehensive map of how pharmaceutical bribes were laundered through European financial institutions. That evidence now enabled prosecutors to pursue charges under international banking laws, money laundering statutes, and foreign corrupt practices regulations. The penalties were severe enough to guarantee life sentences for the most culpable defendants. A knock at the safe house door interrupted my analysis. Agent Davidson entered with a visitor I hadn't expected. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Ethics Committee and one of the few congressional members whose integrity had survived my investigation intact. Dr. Whitmore, she said, settling into the secure conference room, I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Your testimony has triggered constitutional questions about the integrity of our legislative process. I activated a secure presentation system displaying the network analysis I had prepared for exactly this conversation. Senator, what you're looking at is a systematic corruption of democratic institutions by pharmaceutical interests. They haven't just bought individual politicians. They've captured the entire regulatory and legislative apparatus. She studied the charts showing financial flows, policy decisions, and regulatory appointments over the past decade. Jesus. This shows that pharmaceutical companies essentially controlled health policy regardless of which party was in power. Exactly. They played both sides, ensuring that regardless of electoral outcomes, their interests were protected. I highlighted specific examples. When Democrats controlled healthcare committees, pharmaceutical money flowed to Democratic representatives. When Republicans took over, the same companies shifted funding to Republican members. Senator Williams traced the connections with her finger, following money from pharmaceutical companies through various intermediaries to congressional campaigns and personal accounts. The sophistication of this operation is remarkable. They built redundant corruption networks to ensure continuous influence. It gets worse, I said, activating the next presentation. The corruption extends to judicial nominations. Pharmaceutical companies identified federal judges who would rule favorably on liability cases, then ensured those judges received nominations to higher courts through their political allies. The evidence I had compiled showed how pharmaceutical companies had essentially purchased favorable legal precedents by engineering the appointment of sympathetic judges. Patient lawsuits that should have resulted in massive damages were dismissed or settled for minimal amounts because the entire judicial system had been compromised. Dr. Whitmore, Senator Williams said quietly, you're describing the complete capture of American healthcare governance by private interests. That's exactly what I'm describing. And Marcus was just one small part of a machine that has been operating for decades. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. The only way to fix this is to dismantle the entire system and rebuild it with proper oversight and accountability. She was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the implications. What would that rebuilding look like? I had spent months developing proposals for systematic reform, anticipating this exact conversation. Complete financial transparency for all, pharmaceutical interactions with government officials, mandatory cooling-off periods between regulatory positions and industry employment, criminal penalties for safety data manipulation, and independent oversight bodies with subpoena power and protected funding. The industry will fight these reforms with everything they have. Of course they will. That's why the reforms have to be comprehensive and implemented simultaneously. Piecemeal changes will just be circumvented or reversed. I pulled up another presentation showing the political dynamics of reform implementation. But the public outrage from my revelations creates a window of opportunity that won't last long. Senator Williams nodded thoughtfully. I'll need your complete evidence package to draft legislation, and I'll need you to testify in support of specific reform measures. Both are available immediately, I replied. I've been preparing comprehensive reform proposals since I began documenting the corruption. After she left, I returned to monitoring the continuing fallout from my congressional appearance. The stock market had suspended trading in pharmaceutical stocks pending investigation results. International regulators were questioning the safety of American-approved drugs. Medical journals were announcing special issues devoted to research integrity. But the most satisfying development was Marcus's complete professional isolation. His former colleagues were publicly distancing themselves, his research was being retracted from medical journals, and the medical conferences where he had been scheduled to speak were canceling his appearances. Dr. Martinez called with an update from the criminal investigation. Your husband's legal team is exploring plea bargain options. They're finally realizing that the evidence against him is overwhelming. What are they offering? Full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentences. They want to testify against the pharmaceutical executives and congressional members who organized the conspiracy. I smiled at the irony. Marcus, who had built his career on betraying scientific principles for profit, was now preparing to betray his criminal associates to save himself. The man who had never demonstrated loyalty to anything beyond his own advancement was about to learn that his co-conspirators had even less loyalty than he did. Let them negotiate, I replied. But make sure the prosecutors understand that Marcus was a knowing, willing participant in every aspect of the fraud. His cooperation should reduce his sentence, not eliminate it. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor, Jessica Park, the reporter who had conducted my first interview after the charity gala exposure. She had been covering the story's development with exceptional insight, and her reporting had helped shape public understanding of the scandal's significance. Dr. Whitmore, she said, settling into the secure meeting room, I'm working on a comprehensive investigation of how this corruption system developed over time. I need to understand the historical context that enabled such systematic capture of regulatory institutions. I had anticipated this question and prepared materials that would help her tell the complete story. The corruption didn't appear overnight. It evolved over decades as pharmaceutical companies learned to exploit weaknesses in regulatory oversight and political accountability. For the next 2 hours, I walked her through the historical development of pharmaceutical influence operations, showing how companies had gradually expanded their corruption networks from simple bribery to comprehensive institutional capture. The genius of their approach was incremental expansion, I explained. They started with legitimate lobbying and campaign contributions, then gradually crossed ethical and legal boundaries as regulators became accustomed to industry influence. Jessica's investigation would eventually become a Pulitzer Prize-winning series that traced the corruption's roots back to the 1990s, when pharmaceutical companies first began systematically exploiting regulatory loopholes and political connections. What's your next move? She asked as our interview concluded. Rebuilding, I replied simply. The destruction phase is nearly complete. Now comes the more difficult work of creating something better from the wreckage. That rebuilding would involve not just systematic reform of pharmaceutical regulation, but also rebuilding my own life from the foundation up. For 7 years, I had lived as Marcus's wife, suppressing my own ambitions and intelligence to support his career. Now I had the opportunity to become who I was truly meant to be, a scientist, an advocate, and a force for institutional change. The woman Marcus had dismissed as adorable when she tries to understand complex scientific concepts was about to reshape American healthcare policy. The revenge was complete. But the real victory would be measured in lives saved by the reforms my investigation had made possible. Marcus had wanted everyone to see how important and accomplished he was. Instead, everyone now saw him as a criminal, whose arrogance had exposed the corruption that endangered millions of patients. The humiliation was perfect, comprehensive, and permanent. Phase 6 was drawing to a close. The final phase would involve watching justice unfold while I built a new life dedicated to the principles Marcus had betrayed: scientific integrity, patient safety, and public service over private profit. 6 months after my congressional testimony, the federal courthouse in Boston had become the epicenter of the largest healthcare fraud prosecution in American history. 23 defendants faced charges ranging from conspiracy and bribery to manslaughter and racketeering, their cases dominating headlines as the trials finally began. I sat in the witness preparation room, reviewing my testimony for what would be the 7th time I'd taken the stand. Each trial required me to present evidence tailored to specific defendants, walking juries through the intricate web of corruption that had endangered thousands of patients for the sake of pharmaceutical profits. Marcus's trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with a guilty verdict on all counts. Watching him receive a 25-year federal sentence had provided a satisfaction so profound I had to consciously maintain my composed expression for the cameras. The man who had publicly dismissed my intelligence was led away in shackles, while I was recognized as the expert witness whose testimony had made justice possible. Dr. Whitmore. Prosecutor Walsh entered the preparation room with her usual efficiency. Today's testimony focuses on the congressional defendants. Senator Williams's defense team is claiming he was manipulated by pharmaceutical lobbyists rather than being a willing participant in the conspiracy. I pulled up the evidence files that would demolish that defense strategy. Senator Williams initiated contact with pharmaceutical companies, not the other way around. He literally sent them a price list for various legislative favors through his chief of staff. The audio recordings were particularly damaging. Senator Williams discussing how much money he needed for his son's gambling debts, pharmaceutical executives offering to cover those debts in exchange for specific regulatory appointments, and Williams providing confidential committee information to help companies prepare for congressional investigations. His defense argues that he was under financial pressure and made poor decisions, but wasn't part of a criminal conspiracy, Walsh continued. The evidence shows systematic criminal behavior over 3 years, I replied, highlighting specific transactions on my tablet. Williams didn't just accept bribes. He actively recruited other congressional members into the corruption network. He was essentially a pharmaceutical company's legislative manager. The courtroom was packed when I took the stand. Senator Williams sat at the defense table looking haggard and defeated, a far cry from the confident politician who had once wielded significant influence over healthcare policy. His wife sat in the gallery, having already divorced him and cooperated with prosecutors to avoid her own indictment. Defense attorney Morrison approached with the kind of aggressive posture that had become standard when cross-examining me. Every defense team had tried to discredit my evidence or paint me as a vindictive woman driven by personal revenge rather than justice. Dr. Whitmore, he began, isn't it true that you conducted an elaborate deception against your own husband for over 18 months? I had answered variations of this question dozens of times, and my response was polished through repetition. I documented criminal activity that was endangering patients. The fact that one of the criminals happened to be my husband doesn't change the validity of the evidence. But you violated his trust, invaded his privacy, and manipulated him into revealing information he would never have shared willingly. Mr. Morrison, your client accepted bribes to approve dangerous medications that killed patients. Are you really arguing that his privacy rights outweigh the lives of cancer patients who died because of his corruption? The jury's expressions showed exactly the reaction I had calculated. Defense attorneys always made the mistake of trying to make me the villain, which only emphasized the real victims of their clients' crimes. Morrison tried a different approach. Dr. Whitmore, you've profited considerably from exposing this alleged conspiracy. Book deals, speaking fees, consulting contracts. Haven't you turned your husband's downfall into a lucrative career? I've donated every penny of book royalties and speaking fees to organizations that support patients harmed by pharmaceutical fraud, I replied calmly. My consulting work focuses on helping regulatory agencies prevent the kind of corruption your client participated in. That was true, but incomplete. While I had donated the direct profits from my notoriety, the professional opportunities had been transformative. Harvard had offered me an endowed chair in medical ethics. The WHO had recruited me to lead their pharmaceutical oversight reform initiative. The NIH had created a new position for me directing research integrity investigations. Marcus had tried to humiliate me by suggesting I was intellectually inferior. Instead, his criminal behavior had launched me into the most prestigious and influential positions in medical research oversight. Dr. Whitmore, Prosecutor Walsh began her direct examination. Please explain to the jury how Senator Williams's actions directly contributed to patient deaths. I activated the courtroom's presentation system, showing a timeline that connected Williams's legislative actions to specific pharmaceutical approvals and subsequent patient casualties. Senator Williams received $2.3 million in bribes to block legislation that would have required more rigorous safety testing for cancer drugs, I testified. As a direct result, 3 medications reached market with insufficient safety data. Those medications caused preventable deaths in at least 67 patients. The evidence was overwhelming. Williams's bank records showing suspicious deposits, pharmaceutical company emails discussing their investment in his cooperation, and medical records documenting patient deaths that could have been prevented with proper safety protocols. The senator didn't just accept bribes, I continued. He actively worked to weaken regulatory oversight, ensuring that pharmaceutical companies could prioritize profits over patient safety with minimal legal consequences. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict Williams on all counts. He was led away to begin a 30-year sentence. I felt the same satisfaction I had experienced with each successful prosecution. These weren't just legal victories, they were vindication for every patient who had suffered because of pharmaceutical corruption. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for the post-trial press conference that had become routine after each conviction. I had learned to use these opportunities to advance the broader reform agenda, rather than simply celebrating individual prosecutions. Dr. Whitmore, one reporter called out, with this conviction, you've now been instrumental in prosecuting 21 defendants in the pharmaceutical fraud conspiracy. Do you feel that justice has been served? Justice for the defendants, yes, I replied. But justice for the patients who died because of their corruption requires more than prosecutions. It requires systematic reforms to prevent future corruption. That evening, I returned to my new home in Cambridge, a townhouse near Harvard, where I had established my new life as Dr. Sarah Whitmore, medical ethics researcher and pharmaceutical reform advocate. The contrast with my previous life was stark. Instead of playing the decorative wife at corporate events, I now delivered keynote addresses at international medical conferences. My secure phone rang with an update from Dr. Martinez, who had become my primary contact for ongoing investigations. Dr. Whitmore, the European authorities have completed their analysis of your Swiss banking evidence. They're preparing indictments for pharmaceutical executives in Germany, Switzerland, and France. The corruption network had been truly international, with American pharmaceutical companies coordinating their bribery schemes with European partners to manipulate global drug approval processes. My evidence had triggered investigations across multiple countries, creating diplomatic pressure for international cooperation in pharmaceutical oversight. What's the timeline for those prosecutions? I asked. 18 months, assuming extradition proceedings go smoothly. The Swiss government is particularly eager to demonstrate that their banking system won't tolerate money laundering for pharmaceutical fraud. I reviewed my calendar, noting the international travel that would be required for my testimony in foreign courts. The speaking tour I had planned would need to accommodate legal proceedings in Geneva, Frankfurt, and London. That reminded me of another satisfying development. Marcus's international reputation had been completely destroyed. Medical conferences worldwide had retracted his speaking invitations, research journals had blacklisted his publications, and universities had removed him from their boards and advisory committees. The man who had craved international recognition as a medical pioneer was now globally infamous as a symbol of pharmaceutical corruption. The humiliation was complete and permanent. My laptop chimed with an email from Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the former FDA official who had helped me prepare my congressional testimony. She was now leading a Blue Ribbon Commission on pharmaceutical reform, implementing many of the recommendations I had developed during my investigation. "Sarah," her email read, "the FDA has officially adopted your proposed safety protocols for cancer drug trials. The new regulations will require independent oversight boards with subpoena power and criminal liability for executives who suppress safety data. Your investigation has literally rewritten how pharmaceutical research is conducted and regulated." That news provided deeper satisfaction than any individual prosecution. The systematic reforms I had advocated were becoming reality, creating institutional changes that would protect future patients from the kind of corruption that had characterized Marcus's career. I walked to my home office, where I had recreated the evidence analysis setup that had enabled my investigation. The difference was that instead of hiding my work, I now conducted it openly as part of my official duties. The skills I had developed in secret were now recognized as essential expertise for pharmaceutical oversight. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Saw the conviction on the news. Dad wants to know if you're planning to run for Congress yourself." The idea wasn't entirely absurd. Several political organizations had approached me about running for office, arguing that my expertise and public recognition would make me a formidable candidate. But electoral politics held no appeal. I could accomplish more as an independent expert than as a partisan politician. I replied, "Tell Dad I'm more effective operating outside the political system. Politicians come and go, but institutional reforms last decades." That philosophy had guided all my decisions since exposing Marcus's crimes. Rather than seeking personal power or political office, I had focused on creating systematic changes that would outlast any individual's career. A secure video call came in from Senator Patricia Williams, who had become my primary ally in implementing pharmaceutical reforms. "Sarah, I wanted to update you on the legislative package we discussed. We have bipartisan support for the Pharmaceutical Integrity Act, and leadership has scheduled floor votes for next month." The legislation represented the most comprehensive reform of pharmaceutical regulation since the FDA's creation. Independent oversight boards, criminal penalties for safety data manipulation, mandatory cooling-off periods between regulatory and industry employment, and complete financial transparency for all government pharmaceutical interactions. "What's the opposition strategy?" I asked, knowing that surviving pharmaceutical companies would fight the reforms desperately. "They're claiming the regulations will stifle innovation and delay life-saving treatments," Williams replied. "The usual fear-mongering about government interference with medical progress." "I have data that refutes those arguments," I said, pulling up my analysis of how corruption had actually delayed beneficial treatments while fast-tracking dangerous ones. Pharmaceutical fraud has killed more patients than regulatory oversight ever could. After the call ended, I returned to my evening routine, reviewing evidence for upcoming trials, preparing testimony for international proceedings, and developing new protocols for pharmaceutical oversight. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. Every day brought new opportunities to prevent the kind of corruption that Marcus had embodied. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. 18 months ago, I had been the dismissed wife of a pharmaceutical executive, my intelligence mocked and my contributions ignored. Tonight, I was the world's leading expert on pharmaceutical corruption, whose testimony was reshaping global healthcare policy. Marcus had tried to humiliate me in public to enhance his own reputation. Instead, his criminal behavior had destroyed his reputation while elevating mine to international prominence. The revenge had been perfect, comprehensive, devastating, and ultimately beneficial to society. Tomorrow would bring another trial, another opportunity to present evidence that would send corrupt pharmaceutical executives to prison while advancing reforms that would save patients' lives. The work of justice was never finished, but progress was measurable and meaningful. The final phase of my revenge was unfolding exactly as planned. Not just the destruction of those who had betrayed scientific principles, but the construction of a better system in place of what they had corrupted. 2 years after that charity gala where Marcus first humiliated me publicly, I stood before the World Health Assembly in Geneva, delivering the keynote address on pharmaceutical integrity to delegates from 194 nations. The irony was exquisite. The woman Marcus had dismissed as scientifically incompetent was now shaping global health policy while he served his sentence in federal prison. Distinguished delegates, I began, looking out at the assembly hall filled with health ministers, pharmaceutical executives, and patient advocates. 2 years ago, systematic corruption in pharmaceutical research was endangering millions of patients worldwide. Today, we have the opportunity to implement reforms that will protect future generations from the kind of fraud that characterized the old system. The Pharmaceutical Integrity Protocol I was presenting represented the culmination of 2 years of evidence-based reform development. Born from my investigation into Marcus's crimes, it had evolved into a comprehensive framework for international pharmaceutical oversight that was being adopted by regulatory agencies across 6 continents. In the gallery, I spotted Dr. Rebecca Chen, now Director of Global Pharmaceutical Safety at the WHO, who had been instrumental in translating my evidence into policy recommendations. Beside her sat Jessica Park, whose investigative reporting had won the Pulitzer Prize and was now being adapted into a documentary film about pharmaceutical corruption. The reforms we're implementing today didn't emerge from academic theory, I continued, but from real-world evidence of how corruption operates and how it can be prevented. Every protocol, every oversight mechanism, every transparency requirement has been tested against actual cases of pharmaceutical fraud. The presentation detailed how Marcus's network had operated, the bribery schemes, the data manipulation, the regulatory capture, and the patient casualties that resulted. But more importantly, it showed how systematic reforms could prevent similar corruption in the future. Dr. Whitmore, the delegate from Germany, raised his hand during the question. Period. Your evidence led to prosecutions in multiple countries. How do we ensure that these reforms don't simply push corruption underground rather than eliminating it? I activated a slide showing the global monitoring network we had established. Transparency is the enemy of corruption. The new system requires real-time disclosure of all financial relationships between pharmaceutical companies and government officials, with criminal penalties for non-compliance and independent oversight boards with subpoena power. The German delegate nodded approvingly. His country had been particularly affected by the international prosecutions, with 3 major pharmaceutical executives receiving prison sentences based on my evidence. After the assembly session, I met with Dr. Chen and other WHO officials to finalize implementation details for the Global Pharmaceutical Oversight Network. The system would create unprecedented transparency in drug development and approval processes, making the kind of systematic corruption Marcus had participated in virtually impossible. Sarah, Dr. Chen said as we reviewed the final protocols, do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't discovered Marcus's fraud? I considered the question seriously. I'd probably still be playing the role of the supportive wife, my intelligence dismissed and my contributions ignored, while patients continued dying from corrupted medications. I paused, looking out at the Geneva skyline. Marcus's arrogance in humiliating me publicly was actually a gift. It motivated me to expose corruption that might have continued for years otherwise. That evening, I returned to my hotel suite to find a message from my literary agent. The book I had written about the investigation, The Corruption Cure, How Exposing Pharmaceutical Fraud Saved Lives and Reformed Healthcare, had spent 37 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was being translated into 43 languages. More importantly, universities worldwide were using it as a textbook for courses on research ethics, regulatory oversight, and institutional corruption. The woman Marcus had called adorable when she tries to understand complex scientific concepts was now required reading for graduate students in medical ethics and pharmaceutical policy. My secure phone rang with a call from Prosecutor Walsh in Boston. Dr. Whitmore, I wanted to update you on the final prosecutions. The last 3 defendants have accepted plea agreements rather than face trial. That concludes the domestic cases stemming from your investigation. What were the final sentences? CEO Morrison got 18 years, Dr. Crawford received 15, and lobbyist Henderson got 12 years. Combined with the previous convictions, your evidence resulted in prison sentences totaling 347 years for the domestic defendants. The numbers were satisfying, but more important were the institutional changes. Every major pharmaceutical company had restructured their research and development processes to comply with the new transparency requirements. Regulatory agencies had implemented the oversight protocols I had developed. Medical journals had adopted stricter data verification standards. Walsh, I said, I want to visit Marcus before I return to Cambridge. There was a pause. Are you sure that's wise? He's been difficult during his incarceration. Multiple disciplinary actions, refusal to participate in rehabilitation programs, constant complaints about the conditions. I'm sure, I replied. Marcus had spent 2 years in federal prison without any contact from me. It was time for a final conversation, not for his benefit, but for my own sense of closure. 3 days later, I sat in the visitor's room at FCI Petersburg, waiting for Marcus to be brought from his cell. The federal facility housed white-collar criminals serving long sentences, and I had heard from his lawyers that he was not adapting well to incarceration. When Marcus finally appeared, I barely recognized him. The confident, arrogant executive had been replaced by a broken man who looked a decade older than his actual age. His prison jumpsuit hung loosely on his diminished frame, and his once perfect grooming had given way to unkempt hair and hollow eyes. Sarah, he said, sitting across from me at the metal table. I wasn't sure you'd ever come. I've been busy, I replied simply. Reforming the healthcare system that you helped corrupt. He flinched at the directness of my statement. I've been following your career advancement. Congratulations on becoming the world's leading expert on pharmaceutical fraud. The sarcasm in his voice was thin, exhausted. 2 years of imprisonment had drained away most of his arrogance, leaving behind bitterness and regret. Marcus, do you remember the Patterson Medical Gala? When you laughed at my suggestions about drug safety protocols and told everyone to leave the real thinking to the professionals? His eyes closed briefly. Sarah, I've had 2 years to think about that night. And everything that followed, I know Those safety protocols you dismissed? I interrupted. They're now mandatory for pharmaceutical research in 73 countries. The adorable suggestions you mocked have prevented an estimated 12,000 deaths in the past 18 months. Marcus stared at the table, unable to meet my gaze. I was an idiot. I let my ego blind me to what you were capable of. You did more than that, I continued relentlessly. You stole my research, corrupted it for profit, and then tried to humiliate me to make yourself look important. You turned my life's work into a weapon that killed patients. I know. His voice was barely a whisper. I've read every article about the people who died because of oncozyme. I see their faces in my sleep. For a moment, I felt something approaching sympathy for the broken man across from me. But then I remembered the audio recordings of him laughing about patient deaths, the emails where he celebrated bypassing safety regulations, and the arrogant dismissal of anyone who questioned his methods. Marcus, I didn't come here for your apologies or regrets. I came to tell you about the life I've built from the ashes of what you destroyed. I pulled out my tablet, showing him recent headlines about my work. Harvard Endowed Chair in Medical Ethics, WHO Director of Global Pharmaceutical Oversight, Chief Architect of the Pharmaceutical Integrity Protocol that's being implemented worldwide. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the achievements. You've become everything I pretended to be. No, I corrected. I've become what I always was. But you were too arrogant to recognize it. The intelligence you mocked, the expertise you dismissed, the insights you stole, they were always mine. You just prevented me from using them properly. Marcus looked up from the tablet, his expression a mixture of admiration and devastation. You've destroyed my entire legacy. Everything. I built, everyone I worked with, every achievement I claimed, it's all gone. Your legacy was built on fraud and patient deaths, I replied. I simply revealed the truth about what you had created. He was quiet for several minutes, processing the full scope of his downfall and my triumph. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine recognition. Sarah, what you accomplished, the investigation, the evidence gathering, the strategic planning. It required skills and intelligence that I never possessed. I always knew you were brilliant, but I was threatened by it. I tried to diminish you to make myself feel more important. And in doing so, you gave me the motivation to destroy everything you held dear, I replied. If you had simply treated me with respect, acknowledged my contributions, and conducted legitimate research, none of this would have happened. I know. He looked directly at me for the first time during our conversation. I created my own nemesis by trying to humiliate the one person who could expose my crimes. I stood to leave, our conversation complete. Marcus, you have 18 more years to think about that irony. Use the time wisely. As I walked away, I heard him call out one final question. Sarah, do you ever forgive the people who wronged you? I paused at the door, considering my response carefully. Marcus, forgiveness requires accountability and genuine change. You're accountable now, but change. That's something only you can determine. The drive back to Boston gave me time to reflect on the conversation and its significance. Seeing Marcus broken and defeated had provided closure, but it wasn't the source of my satisfaction. The real victory was the life I had built and the system I had helped reform. My phone buzzed with messages as I approached Cambridge. Dr. Kellerman was forwarding congratulations from the medical community on my Geneva speech. Senator Williams was reporting that the Pharmaceutical Integrity Act had passed final Senate approval with only 3 dissenting votes. The WHO was requesting my input on expanding the oversight protocols to include medical device manufacturers. Each message represented another step in the transformation I had initiated. The corrupt system that had enabled Marcus's crimes was being replaced by transparent, accountable institutions that prioritized patient safety over pharmaceutical profits. Pulled into the driveway of my Cambridge home, the house that had become a symbol of my new life. Unlike the Beacon Hill mansion where I had lived as Marcus's decorative wife, this home reflected my actual personality and interests. A laboratory in the basement for independent research, a library filled with medical journals and ethics texts, an office where I continued developing oversight protocols and corruption prevention strategies. Emily was waiting in the kitchen with takeout dinner and her usual sisterly concern. How was the prison visit? You look relieved. Cathartic, I replied, accepting a glass of wine. Marcus is exactly where he belongs, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She studied my expression carefully. No regrets about the methods you used? The deception? The surveillance? The systematic destruction of his life? I considered the question seriously. Emily, Marcus's crimes killed patients and corrupted institutions that were supposed to protect public health. The deception you mentioned was actually an investigation that exposed systematic fraud. The systematic destruction was actually justice being served. But on a personal level? The marriage, the years you spent playing a role? Those years weren't wasted, I replied thoughtfully. They gave me access to evidence that no outside investigator could have obtained. They allowed me to understand how pharmaceutical corruption operates from the inside, and they provided the motivation to pursue justice with a thoroughness that might not have been possible otherwise. Emily raised her wine glass. To turning personal betrayal into public service. To proving that intelligence dismissed can become intelligence deployed strategically, I corrected, clinking glasses with her. That night, I sat in my home office, reviewing the final implementation timeline for the Global Pharmaceutical Oversight Network. Within 6 months, every major regulatory agency would be operating under the new transparency protocols. Independent oversight boards would have subpoena power and criminal liability authority. Real-time financial disclosure would make bribery virtually impossible to conceal. The system Marcus had exploited would cease to exist, replaced by institutions designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had characterized his career. His crimes had provided the evidence and motivation necessary to reform the entire industry. I opened my laptop and began writing the final chapter of my second book, tentatively titled Beyond Revenge: How Personal Justice Can Drive Systematic Reform. The thesis was that individual acts of accountability could catalyze institutional changes that benefited society broadly. Marcus Whitmore tried to humiliate me in public, I wrote, to establish his dominance and dismiss my intelligence, in front of people whose respect he craved. What he accomplished instead was providing the motivation for an investigation that would expose the pharmaceutical industry's systematic corruption and lead to reforms that will save thousands of lives. I paused, considering how to conclude the narrative that had consumed 3 years of my life. The greatest revenge isn't personal destruction. It's proving that those who tried to diminish you were wrong about your capabilities and right to fear your potential. Marcus wanted everyone to see how unimportant I was. Instead, he created the circumstances that proved how important I could become. The irony was perfect and complete. The man who had publicly dismissed my intelligence was now known primarily as the criminal whose arrogance had enabled the exposure of pharmaceutical corruption. His attempt to enhance his reputation had instead destroyed it permanently while elevating mine to international prominence. I looked out my office window at the lights of Cambridge, where tomorrow I would continue the work of preventing pharmaceutical fraud and protecting patients from the kind of corruption Marcus had embodied. The woman he had called scientifically incompetent was now recognized as the world's leading expert on pharmaceutical integrity. The transformation was complete. The revenge was perfect. And the real work, building something better from the ruins of what had been corrupted, would continue for years to come. Marcus had tried to humiliate me in public to prove his superiority. Instead, he had awakened something far more dangerous. A brilliant woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing the truth. The student had become the teacher. The dismissed wife had become the acclaimed expert. The victim had become the victor. And somewhere in a federal prison, Marcus Whitmore was learning that the greatest mistake of his life had been underestimating the woman whose intelligence he had mocked and whose revenge had destroyed everything he had built through lies, theft, and arrogance. The story was complete, but the legacy would endure forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.